Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo through decades in ways we never imagine. In the harsh wilderness of the 1800s frontier, where survival meant everything and sentiment was a luxury few could afford, one cowboy's simple act of mercy would save his life. When he found 3 abandoned donkeys starving along the trail, the town laughed at him for taking such worthless creatures. They called him foolish for wasting resources on animals that couldn't earn their keep. But 14 years later, when bandits cornered him in a canyon with no way out, one of those forgotten donkeys would do something that defied expectations. What could a simple donkey possibly do to save a man's life against armed outlaws? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Mackenzie stood in the doorway of his modest cabin, watching the sun paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 32, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who had lived more years than his age suggested. His hands, scarred and calloused from decades of hard work, wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee as he surveyed the land he called home. The fair ranch wasn't much to look at. A small cabin he'd built himself, a weathered barn that housed his 2 horses, and enough grazing land for maybe 30 head of cattle on a good year. But it was his, earned through sweat and saved pennies from years of working other men's ranches. More importantly, it was far, enough from Copper Creek to give him the solitude he craved, yet close enough to ride into town when necessity demanded. Sam's daily routine had remained unchanged for the past 5 years. Rise before dawn, tend to his horses, a sturdy bay mare named Belle and an aging roan gelding called Chester, check on his small herd of cattle, mend whatever needed mending, and fall into bed exhausted as the stars emerged. It was a simple life, perhaps lonely by some standards, but it suited him just fine. The people of Copper Creek knew Sam Mackenzie as a quiet, capable man who kept to himself. He was polite in his dealings, fair in his business, and reliable when his word was given. But he remained an outsider, having arrived 5 years ago with little more than his horses, his tools, and a story that most folks had learned not to ask about too directly. Doc Whitmore, the town's physician and closest thing Sam had to a friend, was one of the few who had glimpsed beyond the carefully maintained walls. During their occasional chess games at the doctor's office, Sam would sometimes let slip fragments of his past, mentions of places far from Montana, knowledge of wounds that spoke of military experience, and a way of scanning crowds that suggested old habits born of necessity. "You've got the look of a man who's seen things," Doc had observed one evening, studying Sam over the chessboard. "The kind of things that make a person want to find a quiet place to rest their soul." Sam had simply moved his rook and changed the subject, but the doctor's words carried truth. Sam Mackenzie was indeed a man seeking peace, though the reasons remained locked away in a compartment of his heart he rarely opened. Mayor Caldwell viewed Sam with the cautious respect afforded to any man who paid his taxes on time and caused no trouble, but there was an underlying current of curiosity about the newcomer who had purchased the old Henderson place with cash money and asked no favors of anyone. The mayor was a practical man who appreciated other practical men, yet something about Sam Mackenzie's self-sufficiency struck him as almost unnaturally complete. Martha Holloway, who ran the town's only saloon and served as its unofficial information exchange, had taken a motherly interest in Sam from his first day in town. She was a widow herself, having lost her husband to a mine collapse 10 years prior, and she recognized the particular brand of loneliness that Sam carried. Her attempts to introduce him to eligible widows and unmarried daughters had been met with polite deflection, but she persisted with the gentle determination of someone who believed every soul deserved companionship. "A man needs more than cattle and horses for company," she would tell him when he stopped by for his monthly meal in town. "Life's too short to spend it all alone, Sam." He would nod and smile, thank her for the meal, and return to his ranch, where solitude felt safer than the complications that came with human connection. Sam had learned the hard way that caring too deeply for people could lead to devastating loss, and he had built his current life specifically to avoid such vulnerabilities. The truth was that Sam Mackenzie had known a different life once, a life filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that made a man believe in tomorrow. But that was before the wagon train, before the attack that had taken everything that mattered to him in one terrible night. Before he had learned that sometimes the only way to survive unbearable grief was to wrap it so tightly in silence that it became part of your bones. His parents, Thomas and Mary Mackenzie, had been good people, farmers from Ohio who had decided to seek their fortune in the California goldfields. His younger sister, Emma, barely 16 and full of dreams about the adventure that awaited them. His wife of 2 years, Catherine, who had convinced him that starting fresh in a new land was exactly what their young marriage needed. They had been 3 weeks out of independence when the Lakota War Party had found them. Sam still woke some nights to the sound of Emma's scream, still felt the weight of Catherine's body in his arms as her life had slipped away, despite his desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. He had been the only survivor from his family's wagon, and the guilt of that survival had nearly broken him. The wooden cross that hung above his bed was the only remnant of his former life, carved by his father during the long evenings on the deer trail, intended as a house blessing for their new home in California. Sam had clutched it during those first horrible months after the attack, and though his faith had been shaken to its core, he couldn't bring himself to put the cross away. It was all he had left of the people who had loved him completely and who had believed that tomorrow would always be brighter than today. In his saddlebags, wrapped in oiled cloth, he kept a small daguerreotype of Catherine taken on their wedding day. She had been beautiful, not in the flashy way that turned heads, but in the quiet way that made a man grateful to wake up beside her each morning. Sometimes, when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm him, he would take out the photograph and remember what it had felt like to be loved without reservation. But such memories were dangerous luxuries in a life built on the foundation of never again allowing such terrible loss. Sam had chosen this isolated existence deliberately, surrounding himself with the kind of simple, manageable relationships that couldn't shatter his heart if they ended. Cattle could be sold, horses could be replaced, and neighbors could remain at a safe emotional distance. His reputation in the territory was that of a skilled horseman and a man who understood animals. He had a gift for calming spooked horses and reading the behavior of livestock in ways that impressed even veteran ranchers. Some said it came from his solitary nature, that spending so much time alone had made him more attuned to non-human communication. What they didn't know was that Sam's understanding of animals came from years of cavalry training, back when he had been Sergeant Samuel McKenna of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Those skills, learned in service to his country, had been buried along with his true identity when he had decided that Samuel McKenna needed to disappear forever. The man who had once tracked hostile war parties across 100-mile stretches of wilderness now used those same skills to locate strayed cattle and predict weather patterns. The hands that had once held a cavalry saber now wielded hammer and rope with equal precision. The eyes that had once scanned horizons for signs of danger now watched over a peaceful herd with the same unwavering attention to detail. As the evening light faded over his small ranch, Sam finished his coffee and prepared for another solitary night. He checked on Bell and Chester, ensuring they had adequate feed and water for the night. He secured the cabin against whatever weather the mountain darkness might bring. He read a few pages from one of his small collection of books, mostly practical volumes on animal husbandry and agriculture, though he kept a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had belonged to Catherine. Before sleep, he would sit on the edge of his bed and look at his father's wooden cross, offering a brief prayer for the souls of those he had lost and asking for the strength to face another day of chosen isolation. It wasn't much of a life by some standards, but it was honest work that let him sleep at night without the crushing weight of responsibility for other people's welfare. Sam Mackenzie had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed world of solitude was about to be challenged by 3 abandoned creatures who would teach him that some connections transcend choice, and that sometimes the very act of saving something else can end up saving yourself. The October morning was crisp with the promise of an early winter when Sam decided to ride the Devil's Canyon Trail to check for strayed cattle. The narrow path wound through rocky terrain that his herd sometimes favored for the shelter it provided from harsh winds, though it meant a longer ride to reach them. Belle's ears flicked forward as they rounded a bend near the canyon's mouth, and Sam felt her tense beneath him. Something was wrong. His cavalry-trained instincts, never fully dormant despite years of peaceful ranching, sharpened his awareness. He pulled the mare to a stop and listened. The sound came again, a weak, desperate braying that spoke of suffering and abandonment. Sam urged Belle forward, following the sound deeper into the canyon until he saw them. 3 donkeys stood tied to the skeleton of a long-dead tree, their rope halters so frayed and worn that it was a miracle the animals hadn't broken free or strangled themselves in their struggles. But perhaps they had been too weak to struggle much. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he took in their condition. The largest was a female, her grey coat dull and matted, ribs showing starkly through skin that had the stretched, hollow look of prolonged starvation. Her head hung low, but her ears tracked Sam's approach with the last flicker of awareness that separated the living from the dying. Beside her stood a younger male, dark brown with a white star on his forehead. He was in slightly better condition than the female, but not by much. His legs trembled with the effort of standing, and his eyes held the glazed look of an animal pushed beyond its limits. The smallest was a female, probably barely more than a yearling, with a coat that might once have been a rich chestnut, but now appeared faded and patchy. She was the one who had been calling, and as Sam approached, she managed to lift her head and regard him with eyes that held more hope than any creature in her condition had a right to possess. Sam dismounted slowly, speaking in the low, calm tones he had learned worked best with frightened animals. "Easy there, girl. Easy now. I'm here to help." The frayed rope halters told a story that made Sam's jaw clench with anger. These weren't just lost animals, they had been deliberately abandoned. The ropes were old and weathered, suggesting the donkeys had been tied here for days, possibly a week or more. Someone had brought them to this isolated spot and left them to die. The ground around the dead tree was scattered with evidence of their suffering. They had eaten what little grass grew within reach of their tethers, then stripped bark from the dead tree in their desperation. Their hooves had worn a circle in the dirt as they had paced within the limited radius their bonds allowed. Sam approached the largest female first. She flinched when he reached for her halter, but lacked the strength to pull away. The rope was so tight it had worn raw patches on her muzzle, and Sam had to work carefully to loosen the knots without causing additional pain. "Who did this to you?" he murmured as he freed her. "What kind of person leaves living creatures to die like this?" The female staggered when released, but remained standing, watching him with a mixture of wariness and desperate gratitude. Sam moved to the young male next, finding his rope equally tight and worn. This one was more skittish, dancing weakly away from Sam's hands until hunger and thirst overcame fear. The smallest female was last, and when Sam knelt to work on her bonds, she surprised him by stepping forward and resting her muzzle against his shoulder. The gesture was so trusting, so full of faith that help had finally arrived, that Sam felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "You're a sweetheart, aren't you?" he said softly, gently working the rope free. "How long have you been waiting here for someone to find you?" As he freed each animal, Sam's mind raced through his options. The practical side of him, the side that had learned to think like a survivor, catalogued the problems these creatures represented. Winter was coming, and his resources were already stretched thin. Feed was expensive, and 3 additional mouths would strain his budget significantly. He had no experience with donkeys, no facilities designed for them, and no knowledge of their particular needs. But the other side of him, the part that remembered his father's teachings about responsibility to those in need, looked at these suffering animals and saw only beings that required help. The same part that had once risked his life to carry wounded soldiers from battlefields couldn't walk away from creatures that had been callously abandoned to die. Sam returned to Bell and retrieved his water canteen and the small bag of grain he always carried for emergencies. The donkeys fell on both with a desperation that was painful to witness. They drank in careful, controlled sips that showed they still retained survival instincts, and they shared the grain with a restraint that suggested they had learned to make small portions last. Loading 3 weakened donkeys onto a single horse was impossible, so Sam fashioned lead ropes from his spare gear and began the slow journey back to his ranch. The animals followed willingly, though their pace was that of creatures walking on the edge of collapse. The trip that normally took him an hour stretched to 3, as he stopped frequently to let them rest. During these pauses, Sam found himself talking to them, telling them about his ranch, about Bell and Chester, about the warm barn and good feed that waited for them. He told himself he was simply keeping them calm, but the truth was that their quiet presence was oddly comforting. By the time they reached his ranch, word of Sam's discovery had somehow preceded him. Doc Whitmore was waiting by the barn, his medical bag in hand and a concerned expression on his weathered face. "Martha sent word that you'd found some animals in distress," the doctor explained. "Thought you might need help." Together, they settled the donkeys in the barn's unused stalls, providing water, hay, and small portions of grain. Doc Whitmore examined each animal with the same careful attention he might give to human patients, checking their condition and offering advice on their care. "They're in bad shape, Sam," the doctor said as they watched the animals eat. "Another few days, and you'd have found corpses instead of living creatures. Whoever did this—" He shook his head in disgust. The news of Sam's rescue spread through Copper Creek with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By evening, a steady stream of visitors had made their way to his ranch, ostensibly to check on the animals, but really to satisfy curiosity about Sam Mackenzie's latest eccentric behavior. Mayor Caldwell arrived with several prominent townsmen, all wearing expressions that ranged from puzzlement to outright disapproval. "Sam," the mayor began carefully, "I understand you've taken in some livestock that was abandoned." 3 donkeys, Sam confirmed, his tone neutral. "Found them tied to a tree in Devil's Canyon, near starved to death." "That's commendable," Caldwell continued, "but have you considered the practical implications? Donkeys aren't much good for anything. Can't work cattle like horses, can't provide milk or meat like proper livestock. They're just—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic phrase. "Useless mouths to feed," Sam suggested, his voice carrying a hint of steel. "Well, yes, exactly. And with winter coming, every bag of feed costs money. Money that might be better spent on animals that earn their keep." The other men nodded their agreement. These were practical frontier people who understood the harsh mathematics of survival. Sentiment was a luxury that could cost lives when resources were scarce. Sam listened to their concerns without argument, understanding their reasoning even as he rejected it. When they finished speaking, he simply said, "They're my donkeys now, I'll manage." After the delegation left, Martha arrived with a pot of stew and a more sympathetic ear. "Don't mind them," she said as they sat on Sam's porch, watching the rescued animals graze in his small paddock. "They mean well, but they've forgotten that sometimes doing the right thing isn't about what makes the most sense on paper." Sam appreciated her support, but as he lay in bed that night listening to the unfamiliar sounds from his barn, he wondered if the practical voices hadn't been right. 3 more mouths to feed, no additional income, and animals that might never be truly useful in the way that horses and cattle were useful. But when he stepped outside the next morning and saw the smallest female approach the fence with her ears forward and her tail swishing in what could only be described as a greeting, Sam realized that usefulness might not be the only measure of worth. The frayed rope halters lay discarded in his barn, silent testimony to the cruelty that had brought these creatures into his life. But as Sam went about his morning chores, with 3 donkeys watching his every move with growing trust and curiosity, he began to suspect that sometimes the most important decisions couldn't be measured in dollars and practicality. Sometimes a man had to act from the heart and trust that the consequences would sort themselves out. The November wind carried the bite of approaching winter as Sam carried the special bag of oats from his cabin to the barn. These weren't ordinary oats. They were the premium grade he had been saving for Belle and Chester, the kind that cost 3 times what regular feed did and was typically reserved for working horses that needed extra nutrition. But as he looked at the 3 donkeys in their stalls, he made a decision that his practical side questioned even as his heart demanded it. The animals were improving, but slowly, too slowly. Their ribs still showed, their coats remained dull, and their energy levels barely carried them through the basic activities of eating and drinking. They needed the kind of nutrition that only the best feed could provide. "Easy, Jenny," he murmured, to the largest female as he approached her stall. The name had come to him during his 2nd week of caring for her, when her protective instincts toward the other 2 had become apparent. She reminded him of his grandmother's sister, a stern but caring woman who had looked after every stray creature in the county. Jenny had been the most suspicious of his help initially, her survival instincts warning her that humans had brought nothing but suffering. But hunger and Sam's patient consistency had gradually worn down her defenses. Now she allowed him to approach, though she still watched his every movement with careful attention. He poured a generous portion of the premium oats into her feed bucket, far more than he could truly afford to spare. Jenny sniffed the grain cautiously, then began eating with the controlled urgency of an animal that had learned not to waste good fortune. "And you, Buck," Sam said, moving to the next stall. The young male had earned his name through his initial tendency to kick at anything that startled him, though that behavior was fading as his strength returned. Buck had the most potential for mischief among the 3, and Sam could see intelligence in his dark eyes that suggested future challenges. Buck greeted his portion of premium oats with enthusiasm, his ears pricking forward in what Sam had come to recognize as the donkey equivalent of a smile. The animal's personality was emerging more clearly each day, playful, curious, and possessed of a stubborn streak that was both endearing and exasperating. The smallest female, whom Sam had started, calling Rosie for her surprisingly gentle nature, received her share with quiet gratitude. She was the most trusting of the 3, often approaching Sam without prompting and seeming to enjoy his company beyond the mere provision of food. Her recovery was perhaps the most dramatic, as proper nutrition allowed her youthful resilience to shine through. As Sam watched them eat, he calculated the cost of his generosity. The premium oats represented a significant portion of his winter feed budget, money he had planned to use for Belle and Chester's needs during the harsh months ahead. He would have to find a way to stretch his remaining resources, perhaps by supplementing with hay he cut himself, or by finding additional work in town. The rational part of his mind catalogued these concerns with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to survival mathematics. But the part of him that had chosen to bring these animals home in the first place found satisfaction in watching their gradual improvement. Each day brought small victories, brighter eyes, more energy, coats that were slowly beginning to show, and their true colors. Doc Whitmore visited regularly during those first few weeks, officially to check on the donkey's progress, but really to provide Sam with companionship during what the doctor recognized as a challenging time. During one such visit, as they watched the animals move around the small paddock with increasing vigor, Doc made an observation that stuck with Sam. "You know," the older man said thoughtfully, "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've learned that healing isn't just about medicine or proper treatment. Sometimes it's about giving a creature, human or animal, a reason to want to get better." Sam pondered those words as he went about his daily routine of caring for the donkeys. Their improvement wasn't just physical. There was something in their behavior that spoke of emotional healing as well. Jenny's suspicious nature was giving way to cautious trust. Buck's defensive kicking had been replaced by playful nudging. Rosie had begun following Sam around the paddock like a large, four-legged puppy. The town's reaction to his continuing care of the animals ranged from bemused tolerance to outright criticism. During his weekly trip to the general store, Sam endured pointed comments about the wisdom of feeding useless animals while winter approached. Mrs. Henderson, the store owner's wife, made no attempt to hide her disapproval. "Samuel Mackenzie," she said loudly enough for other customers to hear, "I hope you're not planning to let sentiment bankrupt you. Those donkeys won't help you survive a hard winter." Sam paid for his supplies without responding to her criticism, but her words followed him home. That evening, as he portioned out another generous helping of the premium oats, he found himself questioning his choices. Was he being foolishly sentimental? Was he risking his own survival for animals that might never provide any practical benefit? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning when he discovered that a gate latch had come loose during the night, allowing several of his cattle to wander into the neighboring property. It was the kind of problem that could lead to disputes with his neighbor and potential damage to crops or fencing. Sam was preparing to saddle Belle for what would likely be a long day of tracking and retrieving the strayed cattle when Buck appeared. At his side, nuzzling his shoulder with what seemed like purposeful intent. The donkey moved toward the open gate, then stopped and looked back at Sam with unmistakable meaning. Following Buck's lead, Sam discovered that the young donkey somehow understood the situation. Buck led him directly to where the cattle had gathered, near his neighbor's water source, saving Sam hours of searching. More surprisingly, the donkey seemed to understand how to help move the cattle, positioning himself to encourage the herd's movement back toward their proper pasture. The incident was minor, but it revealed something important about Buck's intelligence and willingness to help. Sam began to wonder if the town's assessment of donkeys as useless might be based on limited understanding rather than actual truth. Jenny revealed her own capabilities a few days later when a pack of coyotes ventured too close to the ranch. Buildings during an early snowfall. While Belle and Chester remained nervous in their stalls, Jenny positioned herself between the predators and the other animals, her ears laid back and her body language radiating protective determination. Her braying was so fierce and sustained that the coyotes retreated, apparently deciding that easier prey could be found elsewhere. Rosie's contribution was more subtle, but perhaps most meaningful to Sam personally. During the long evenings when loneliness pressed down on him like a weight, she seemed to sense his mood and would approach the fence where he sat, offering her quiet companionship. There was something about her presence that made the silence feel less empty, the solitude less absolute. As the first serious snow began to fall, covering the mountain peaks in pristine white, Sam reflected on the changes that 3 abandoned donkeys had brought to his carefully ordered life. His feed costs had indeed increased significantly, and he would need to be more careful with his resources throughout the winter. But he was no longer entirely alone with his memories and regrets. 3 creatures depended on him for their survival, and in caring for them, he had discovered that the act of nurturing could heal the caregiver as well as the cared for. The premium oats were nearly gone, sacrificed to the cause of returning strength and health to animals that had been left to die. Sam looked at the nearly empty bag and realized he felt no regret about the expense. Some investments couldn't be measured in monetary terms. The March thaw came early that year, turning the mountain snow into rushing streams and revealing the green promise of spring beneath winter's brown blanket. Sam stood in his paddock, watching. Jenny, Buck and Rosie explore the expanding patches of new grass with the enthusiasm of creatures celebrating their survival. The transformation was remarkable. Jenny's grey coat now gleamed with health, her ribs no longer visible beneath muscle that had filled out through months of good care. Buck had grown taller and stronger, his playful nature now supported by the energy of robust health. Rosie, though still the smallest, had developed into a beautiful young donkey whose chestnut coat caught the morning sunlight like polished copper. More than their physical recovery, their personalities had fully emerged during the long winter months. Jenny had become the undisputed leader of the small herd, her protective instincts extending not only to Buck and Rosie, but to Sam himself. She would position herself between him and any potential threat, a habit that had proven useful when a black bear had wandered onto the property in late February. Buck had revealed an unexpected aptitude for work that challenged the town's assumption about donkeys being useless. Sam had discovered that the young male could carry water buckets without spilling, help move fence posts with surprising strength, and even assist with herding cattle. His intelligence seemed to grow daily, and Sam often caught him watching human activities with the focused attention of someone trying to understand how he might help. Rosie had become Sam's constant companion during outdoor work, following him around the ranch with devoted attention. Her gentle nature made her ideal for the smaller tasks, carrying tools in specially designed packs, alerting Sam to problems by her behavior, and providing the kind of steady, uncomplicated companionship that eased the loneliness he had lived with for so long. The integration of the donkeys into his daily routine had happened so gradually that Sam barely noticed when they became essential parts of his operation. Jenny carried water to distant pastures where his cattle grazed. Buck helped repair fencing, his strength making one-man jobs manageable. Rosie served as an early warning system, her acute hearing and attention alerting Sam to visitors, weather changes, or problems with the livestock. But it was during a quiet evening in early April, as Sam sat on his porch watching the 3 donkeys graze in the fading light, that he realized how profoundly they had changed his life. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to share his thoughts with someone or something that might understand. That night, he retrieved the faded daguerreotype of Catherine from his saddlebags and carried it to the barn. The donkeys gathered around him, as they often did during his evening chores, and Sam found himself speaking to them in a way he hadn't spoken to anyone since his wife's death. "She would have liked you 3, he said softly, showing them the photograph. "Catherine always said that kindness to animals was the measure of a person's character. She would have scolded me for waiting so long to bring you home." Rosie stepped closer, her warm breath stirring the hair at his temple as she investigated the photograph with gentle curiosity. Jenny watched from a respectful distance, her ears forward in the attentive posture Sam had learned meant she was listening. Buck, ever the youngster, tried to nibble the corner of the photograph until a gentle word from Sam redirected his attention. "I haven't talked about her in years," Sam continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Haven't talked about any of them. My parents, my sister Emma. I thought if I didn't speak about them, it wouldn't hurt so much to remember." The donkeys listened with the patience of creatures that understood the weight of sorrow, even if they couldn't comprehend the specific words. Their quiet presence created a safe space for Sam to voice thoughts he had kept locked away for half a decade. "The guilt never goes away," he admitted. "I survived when they didn't, and I've spent every day since wondering why. What made my life more valuable than theirs? What gave me the right to keep breathing when they couldn't?" Jenny moved closer, her large, dark eyes reflecting understanding that seemed to go beyond mere animal instinct. She rested her muzzle against Sam's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that reminded him powerfully of Rosie's first response to kindness. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Sam quickly tucked the photograph away and stepped out of the barn to see a rider approaching at a pace that suggested urgency. It was young Tommy Peterson from town, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mr. Mackenzie," Tommy called as he pulled his mount to a stop. "Doc Whitmore sent me to warn everyone in the outlying ranches. There's been trouble up north. The Blackstone gang hit the bank in Cedar Falls, killed 2 men and wounded 3 others. Sam felt his old cavalry instincts sharpen. "How recent?" "3 days ago. Sheriff thinks they're moving south, maybe heading for the territorial border. Doc wanted everyone to know, in case they come through this area." After Tommy left to continue his warnings to other ranches, Sam found himself unconsciously checking the security of his buildings and considering defensive positions. It had been years since he had thought in military terms, but the habits of a lifetime didn't fade easily. The donkeys seemed to sense the change in his mood. Buck became more alert, his ears constantly moving as he monitored sounds from beyond the ranch. Jenny positioned herself where she could observe the main approach to the buildings. Even Rosie lost some of her playful demeanor, staying closer to Sam during his evening chores. That night, Sam cleaned and loaded his old service revolver for the first time since arriving in Montana. The weight of the weapon in his hands brought back memories he had spent years trying to forget. Memories of command, of responsibility for other men's lives, of the terrible decisions that warfare demanded. A traveling merchant arrived the next morning, his wagon loaded with goods for the various ranches and farms in the area. After conducting his business, the man lingered over coffee, clearly eager to share news from his travels. "Heard you've got yourself some donkeys," the merchant said, glancing toward the paddock where the 3 animals grazed. "Fine-looking beasts. I'd be interested in making an offer if you're looking to sell." The suggestion hit Sam with unexpected force. The practical benefits were obvious. Donkeys were worth good money to the right buyer, and the sale would significantly improve his financial situation. 3 mouths fewer to feed, 3 animals fewer to worry about if dangerous times were coming. "They're not for sale," Sam heard himself say before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. The merchant raised his eyebrows. "I can offer fair market value, plus a premium for their obviously good condition. That's a substantial sum, Mr. Mackenzie. I said they're not for sale." After the merchant left, Sam stood at his fence watching Jenny, Buck and Rosie go about, their daily routine of grazing, playing, and keeping watch over their small domain. When had these animals become so important to him that the thought of selling them felt like betrayal? The answer came as he remembered the photograph of Catherine and the way the donkeys had listened as he shared his deepest grief. They had become more than livestock. They had become the family he thought he would never have again. As evening approached and news of the Blackstone gang's activities continued to filter in from other travelers, Sam realized that his carefully constructed life of solitude was becoming more complicated by the day. He had 3 animals that depended on him, a growing sense of connection to the community of Copper Creek, and the stirring of protective instincts he had thought were buried forever. The simple act of saving 3 abandoned donkeys had set in motion changes that were reshaping the man he had chosen to become. 3 years had passed since Sam first discovered the donkeys in Devil's Canyon, and the seasons had woven them so thoroughly into the fabric of his life that he could barely remember what the ranch had felt like without them. Jenny, now mature and dignified, had assumed the role of unofficial ranch foreman, somehow understanding Sam's routines well enough to anticipate his needs. Buck had grown into a powerful young male whose intelligence had proven invaluable in ways that continued to surprise even Sam. Rosie, though still the smallest, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense Sam's moods and respond accordingly. The town's attitude toward Donkey Sam had evolved from mockery to grudging respect as the animals proved their worth time and again. Even Mayor Caldwell had been forced to acknowledge their value after Buck helped recover his own strayed horses during a spring storm, saving the mayor significant time and expense. But the peaceful routine of ranch life was beginning to show. Cracks, and Sam's carefully buried military instincts were stirring with increasing frequency. Reports of bandit activity throughout the territory had grown more frequent and more troubling over the past year. What had once been occasional opportunistic robberies had escalated into coordinated attacks that suggested organization and planning. The Blackstone Gang, which had been a distant concern 3 years ago, had grown bolder and more violent. Their latest reported crime, the brutal robbery of a church collection in a small settlement north of Copper Creek, had left 4 people dead and an entire community terrorized. The territorial governor had placed a substantial bounty on the gang's leader, but that had only seemed to make them more dangerous. Sam stood in his barn, ostensibly checking harness repairs, but his attention was focused on the small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside that box, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the silver cavalry badge that represented the life he had abandoned when he became Sam Mackenzie. Sergeant Samuel McKenna of the 7th Cavalry Regiment had earned that badge through years of faithful service and actions that had saved the lives of fellow soldiers. But Samuel McKenna was also the man whose testimony had sent corrupt officers to prison, whose investigation had uncovered a weapon-selling scheme that reached into the highest levels of military command. The enemies he had made during those trials were the reason Sam Mackenzie existed at all. A new identity created out of necessity when staying alive required disappearing completely. The badge felt heavier than he remembered as he held it in his palm. The silver had tarnished with age, but the engravings remained crisp. His name, rank, and unit number that had once been sources of pride. Now they felt like artifacts from someone else's life, reminders of responsibilities and skills he had hoped never to need again. Jenny's soft nicker from her stall interrupted his brooding. She had developed an uncanny ability to sense when his thoughts turned dark, and her gentle presence had become one of his most reliable sources of comfort. He tucked the badge away and moved to scratch behind her ears, finding the simple contact. "Grounding. You always know, don't you, girl?" he murmured. "Always know when I'm wrestling with ghosts." The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the main road. A small wagon was making its way toward his ranch, and Sam recognized the driver as Sarah Coleman, the widow who had recently purchased the old Morrison place 2 miles to the east. She was an attractive woman in her early 30s, with the kind of practical beauty that spoke of strength and resilience. Her husband had died in a mining accident 2 years prior, leaving her to raise their young son and maintain their small farm alone. Sam had spoken with Sarah only briefly during her occasional trips to town, but he had been impressed by her determination and grace under difficult circumstances. Now, as her wagon pulled into his yard, he could see that she was troubled about something. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, stepping out to meet her. "Is everything all right?" Sarah's usual composure was strained, and her hands trembled slightly as she climbed down from the wagon. "Mr. Mackenzie, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know where else to turn. There were men at my place yesterday, 3 of them, asking questions about the area, about who lived where and what they might have worth taking." Sam's military training immediately catalogued the implications. Scouts, the Blackstone Gang, was known to send advance men to gather intelligence before larger operations. Did they threaten you directly? Not exactly. But there was something about the way they looked at my property, at my son. She shuddered. They weren't just passing through, Mr. Mackenzie. They were evaluating. The protective instincts that Sam had spent years suppressing flared to life. The thought of armed men threatening a widow and her child activated responses that belonged to Sergeant McKenna, not peaceful rancher Sam Mackenzie. "You're welcome to stay here until we know more about what they're planning," he offered. Have extra space in the cabin, and your son would be safer here than isolated on your farm." Sarah's relief was visible. "I was hoping you might say that. I've heard, well, people in town say you have experience with dangerous situations." The comment caught Sam off guard. He had been careful to keep his military background hidden, but apparently his reactions to various situations had been more revealing than he realized. "I've dealt with trouble before," he admitted carefully. As Sarah settled her wagon and her 8-year-old son David began exploring the ranch with the enthusiasm of a child discovering new wonders, Sam found his thoughts turning inevitably to defense preparations, the layout of his buildings, the approaches that would need to be watched, the weapons and ammunition he had available, all catalogued with the automatic efficiency of trained military thinking. The donkeys seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Buck began patrolling the perimeter of the paddock with purposeful attention, his ears constantly moving as he monitored sounds from the surrounding area. Jenny positioned herself where she could observe the main approaches to the ranch. Even Rosie stayed closer to the buildings, her usual wandering replaced by watchful alertness. That evening, as Sarah helped prepare dinner and young David peppered Sam with questions about ranch life, Sam realized how much he had missed the simple pleasure of human company. The cabin felt warmer with other voices in it, and the silence that had been his companion for so many years suddenly seemed less like peace and more like isolation. But underneath the domestic comfort ran a current of tension that Sam couldn't ignore. His instincts, honed by years of warfare and sharpened by survival, insisted that danger was approaching. The men who had visited Sarah's farm were part of something larger, and the isolation that had once been Sam's refuge was about to become a vulnerability. After Sarah and David had settled into the spare room and the evening chores were completed, Sam walked the perimeter of his property with the methodical attention of a soldier preparing for battle. The donkeys followed him, their behavior confirming his suspicions that something was different about the night. In the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, Sam caught sight of a small campfire burning in the hills above his ranch. It was positioned perfectly to observe his property while remaining hidden from casual view. Professional placement, military-quality surveillance. The Blackstone gang, or their scouts, were already here. As Sam returned to the cabin and checked the loads in his weapons, he realized that the peaceful life he had built was about to collide violently with the dangerous past he had tried to leave behind. The silver cavalry badge hidden in his barn represented skills and knowledge that Sam Mackenzie the rancher had never needed, but Sergeant McKenna's expertise might be the only thing that could protect the people and animals who had become his family. The transformation from peaceful rancher back to cavalry scout was beginning, whether he wanted it or not. Sam spread the hand-drawn map across his kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee cups as Sarah and young David slept in the next room. By lamplight, the carefully sketched terrain looked like what it was, a military tactical assessment drawn by someone who understood the relationship between geography and survival. Every approach to the ranch was marked, elevation changes noted, and potential defensive positions identified with the precise symbols he had learned during his cavalry training. Escape routes were traced in red ink, each one carefully evaluated for its advantages and vulnerabilities. Water sources, natural barriers, and sightlines were all documented with the thoroughness of a professional soldier preparing for battle. The map represented 2 days of careful reconnaissance, conducted under the pretext of checking on his cattle and repairing fencing. But Sam's real purpose had been to understand how his peaceful ranch might be transformed into a battlefield if circumstances demanded it. The campfire he had spotted 3 nights ago had moved twice since then, always maintaining visual contact with his property while avoiding detection by anyone less trained in reading the landscape. Professional surveillance. The kind of patient, methodical observation that preceded planned attacks. Sam's sleep had grown increasingly restless as his military instincts forced their way back to the surface. Dreams of Catherine and his family were replaced by tactical nightmares, scenarios where armed men approached his buildings under cover of darkness, where Sarah and David became casualties of a war they had never asked to join. The donkey's behavior confirmed his growing suspicions. Jenny had begun gathering Buck and Rosie into tight formations whenever they grazed, positioning herself between them and the hills where the watchers lurked. Buck's playful nature had been replaced by constant vigilance, his ears tracking sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Rosie stayed within sight of the buildings at all times, abandoning her usual wandering in favor of nervous proximity to safety. Animals, Sam knew, possessed instincts that humans had civilized out of themselves. Their reactions were rarely wrong. When danger threatened, a soft footstep behind him made Sam's hand drift instinctively toward his weapon before Sarah's voice identified her as the source. "You're planning for war," she observed quietly, studying the map from over his shoulder. Sam considered denying it, maintaining the fiction that he was simply a careful rancher concerned about property security. But the precision of his tactical planning was too obvious to be dismissed as amateur preparation. "I'm planning to keep you and David safe," he said instead. Sarah moved around the table to face him, her expression serious in the flickering lamplight. "There's more to you than people in town realize, isn't there, Sam? This map, these aren't the drawings of someone who learned strategy from books." The question hung between them, loaded with implications that could reshape their developing relationship. Sam had grown comfortable with Sarah's presence in his home, had found himself looking forward to their conversations over dinner, and enjoying the sound of David's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. But trust was a luxury that might prove dangerous if his past caught up with them. "I was in the army," Sam admitted carefully. "Long time ago, before I came to Montana. Some things you never forget." What kind of soldier draws maps like this? The direct question deserved a direct answer, even if it revealed more than Sam wanted. To share, the kind who was responsible for keeping other soldiers alive in hostile territory. Sarah studied his face, her intelligent eyes reading the weight of experiences he couldn't voice. "And now you're responsible for keeping us alive." It wasn't really a question, but Sam nodded anyway. "Those men who came to your farm weren't casual travelers, Sarah. They were gathering intelligence for something bigger." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of movement from the barn drew Sam's attention. Through the window, he could see Jenny's silhouette in the paddock, her head raised and ears forward in the posture that meant she was listening to something beyond normal human perception. Sam extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, scanning the darkness with eyes trained to read the night landscape. Sarah joined him, her presence warm against his shoulder as they watched for signs of movement. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward a stand of trees 50 yards from the house. Sam saw it too, a shadow that moved with too much purpose to be natural, advancing toward the buildings with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be detected. He was reaching for his rifle when Jenny's braying split the night air, followed immediately by Buck's deeper call and Rosie's higher-pitched alarm. The shadow froze, caught between advance and retreat by the unexpected warning system. For a long moment, the night held its breath. Then the figure melted back into the trees with the fluid motion of someone experienced in such retreats. "Scout?" Sam said quietly, "checking our defensive preparations, looking for weaknesses." Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch conveying both fear and trust. "What do we do?" Sam considered their options with the methodical thinking of a soldier who understood that survival often depended on making the right choice quickly. They could flee, load Sarah and David into a wagon, and head for town under cover of darkness. But running would only delay the confrontation, and it would leave his ranch and the donkeys vulnerable to retaliation. They could send word to the territorial authorities, but help was days away even if the message reached them safely. By the time outside assistance arrived, Whatever the Blackstone gang was planning would be finished, or they could stay and fight, using Sam's military knowledge and the terrain advantages he had mapped so carefully to turn his ranch into a fortress that could hold off attackers until help arrived. "We make our stand here," Sam decided. "Tomorrow I'll ride to town and warn the sheriff, but I won't abandon everything I've built to run from criminals." Sarah nodded, understanding the choice even as she recognized its dangers. "What about David?" "He stays here where I can protect him. The safest place for both of you is wherever I am when the trouble starts." The next morning brought news that confirmed Sam's worst fears. A messenger from the territorial capital arrived in Copper Creek with word that the Blackstone gang had hit 2 more settlements, their attacks growing bolder and more coordinated. The gang's leader, known only as Blackjack Morrison, had put a price on the head of anyone who provided information leading to their capture. But more troubling was the messenger's description of Morrison himself, a tall man with graying hair and a scar across his left cheek, who had been overheard asking specific questions about former military personnel living in the area. Sam felt the cold touch of recognition. He knew that scar, knew the man who bore it. Captain William Morrison, formerly of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, court-martialed and sentenced to military prison based on evidence that Sergeant Samuel McKenna had uncovered and testified about. Morrison had been released from prison 2 years ago, according to the territorial records. 2 years he had spent planning his revenge against the man whose testimony had destroyed his military career and sent him to disgrace. The peaceful rancher Sam Mackenzie had tried to become was about to face the violent past that Sergeant McKenna had left behind. And this time he wouldn't be fighting just for his own survival. He would be protecting the family he had found in Sarah and David, and the animals who had taught him that love was worth the risk of loss. That evening, as Sam updated his tactical map with new information about Morrison's methods and likely approaches, the donkeys gathered outside the cabin windows as if they understood that the final confrontation was approaching. Jenny positioned herself facing the hills where danger lurked, her protective stance clearly declaring her readiness to defend her family. Buck paced the fence line with nervous energy, his intelligence focused on the coming threat. Rosie stayed close to the cabin, her gentle nature transformed into fierce loyalty by the approaching danger. Sam realized that he was no longer planning to defend his ranch alone. He had allies, human and animal, who had chosen to stand with him against whatever Morrison brought to their door. The map before him was no longer just a tactical assessment. It was a battle plan for protecting everything that had given his life meaning since the day he had chosen mercy over practicality and brought 3 dying donkeys home. The torn wanted poster lay on Sam's kitchen table like an accusation. The paper was yellow with age and travel stained from years of being carried in someone's saddlebags, but the photograph was unmistakable, a younger version of himself in cavalry uniform, staring out from beneath the bold text. "Wanted for questioning, Sergeant Samuel McKenna, 7th Cavalry Regiment." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale as she stared at the poster that had been nailed to Sam's front door sometime during the night. David peered around his mother's skirts, too young to understand the implications, but old enough to sense the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "Samuel McKenna," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Not Sam Mackenzie. The carefully constructed identity that had protected him for 8 years was crumbling, destroyed by a piece of paper and the patient vengeance of a man he had hoped never to see again. Sam closed his eyes, feeling the weight of deception settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "Sam," he said quietly, not looking at her. "My name is still Sam. Everything else, everything between us, that's been real." But even as he spoke, Sam knew that the revelation changed everything. The trust they had been building, the tentative feelings that had developed between them, the simple peace of sharing his home with people who cared about him, all of it now rested on the foundation of a lie he had never intended to tell, but had never found the courage to correct. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the terrible silence. Through the window, Sam could see a group of riders approaching his ranch, not the careful hidden observation of the past few days, but an open, confident advance. 8 men, all armed, led by a figure Sam recognized despite the years that he had passed. Captain William Morrison had aged hard during his time in military prison. His once proud bearing had been replaced by the predatory slouch of a man who had learned to survive through violence and cunning. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento of the investigation that had brought him down, had faded to a pale line that only emphasized the cruel set of his features. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison called out as his men spread in a loose semicircle around the ranch buildings, "I give you the famous Sergeant Samuel McKenna, hero of the frontier, destroyer of corrupt officers, and the man who cost me my career, my reputation, and 5 years of my life." Sam stepped onto his porch, his hands visible but positioned near his weapons. Behind him, he could hear Sarah gathering David and moving toward the back of the cabin. The donkeys in the paddock had gone completely still, their attention focused on the armed men with the intensity of prey animals, recognizing predators. "Morrison," Sam said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect from enlisted men and officers alike. "You're a long way from anywhere that matters." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Oh, but this is exactly where I need to be, Sergeant. You see, I've spent the last 2 years tracking down every detail of your new life. Samuel McKenna dies in a tragic accident, and Sam Mackenzie appears in Montana with just enough money to buy a ranch and start over. Very clever." The gang leader dismounted, his men remaining horsed but alert. Sam noted their positions, their weapons, their probable lines of attack, with the automatic assessment of trained military thinking. 8 against 1, with civilians in the building behind him. Not impossible odds if he could control the engagement, but dangerous for anyone he was trying to protect. "What happened to you wasn't my fault, Morrison. You were selling cavalry weapons to hostile tribes. Men died because of what you did. Men died because you couldn't mind your own business." Morrison's composure cracked, revealing the bitter rage that had sustained him through years of planning this confrontation. "I was providing for my family, making deals that kept peace with the tribes and profits in my pocket. You destroyed all of that with your righteous testimony." Sam remembered the investigation with painful clarity. It had begun when weapons from a missing cavalry supply train had turned up in the hands of a Lakota war party that attacked a civilian settlement. The serial numbers had led back to Morrison's unit, and Sam's tracking skills had uncovered the evidence of systematic theft and illegal sales. The trial had been a sensation. A respected cavalry officer revealed as a criminal who had endangered military operations and civilian lives for personal profit. Sam's testimony, delivered with the precision and credibility of an exemplary soldier, had been the key evidence that sent Morrison to prison. "You had choices," Sam said. "You chose profit over duty, and you chose to play hero. How did that work out for you, Sergeant? How many men died because you were more concerned with following regulations than understanding the realities of frontier warfare?" The words hit Sam like physical blows because they echoed doubts he had carried for years. Had his rigid adherence to military law cost lives? Could Morrison's illegal weapons sales have prevented some of the violence that followed? The questions had haunted Sam's dreams during the dark months after his family's death, when grief and guilt had nearly destroyed him. "I followed my oath," Sam said, but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. Morrison smiled, sensing vulnerability. "Your oath, your precious duty. And where did it lead? Your family dead, your identity destroyed, hiding in the mountains, in playing cowboy with rescued animals." Sarah's sharp intake of breath from inside the cabin told Sam that she was listening, learning the full truth about the man she had begun to trust. The weight of her judgment added another layer to the crushing pressure of Morrison's presence. "But I'm not here just for revenge, McKenna. Oh, revenge is sweet, but it doesn't pay. Your little town has a bank, and that bank has money. Your neighbors have valuables, and your friends have lives that they'll pay to protect." Sam understood. Immediately. Morrison wasn't just seeking personal vengeance, he was using the confrontation as leverage for a larger operation. The Blackstone gang's recent crimes had been preparation for this moment, building their reputation and resources for a coordinated attack on Copper Creek. "The town has nothing to do with our history. Everything has to do with our history." Morrison's voice rose to a shout. "Every choice, every consequence, every dead end you forced me into by destroying my life. The difference is that this time, I'm in control." One of Morrison's men leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, we gonna stand here talking all day? Town's waiting." Morrison raised a hand to silence his subordinate, but his eyes never left Sam's face. "Here's how this works, Sergeant. You're going to come with us, nice and cooperative-like. You're going to help us take that bank, and you're going to use your reputation in town to make sure nobody gets heroic ideas about resistance. And if I refuse," Morrison gestured toward the cabin where Sarah and David sheltered, "then the widow and her boy pay the price for your stubbornness. And after that, we take the town anyway, but with a lot more violence than necessary." Sam felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, the kind of decision that had defined his military career and destroyed his peace of mind. Surrender and become complicit in Morrison's crimes, or resist and watch innocent people die for his principles. But this time was different. This time he wasn't alone. Jenny's loud braying split the air, followed immediately by Buck and Rosie adding their voices to her call. The sound wasn't random. It was the same pattern they used to alert Sam to dangers around the ranch, but amplified into something that carried across the valley toward town. Morrison's men looked nervous as the donkeys continued their coordinated alarm, their voices echoing off the canyon walls and multiplying into a sound that would be audible for miles. Sam realized what they were doing, alerting the entire area that trouble had come to the Mackenzie Ranch. "Shut those animals up!" Morrison snapped at one of his men, but the donkeys had positioned themselves strategically around the paddock too, far apart to silence quickly and too alert to be approached by strangers. Their continued calling was already being answered by distant sounds, dogs barking, horses nickering, and the faint sounds of human activity as neighbors responded to the alarm. Sam allowed himself a small smile. His 3 rescued donkeys were proving that intelligence and loyalty could be more valuable than weapons when survival was at stake. Morrison's face flushed with anger as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation was spinning out of control. "You've got 1 minute to decide, McKenna. Come with us quietly, or watch everyone you care about pay for your heroics." But Sam was no longer the guilt-ridden survivor who had fled his past to hide in the mountains. The presence of Sarah and David, the loyalty of 3 animals who owed him their lives, and the approaching sounds of neighbors responding to the alarm had reminded him of something he had forgotten during his years of self-imposed exile. Sometimes a man's principles were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossibly bad. "My name is Sam Mackenzie," he said clearly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his courage again. "And this is my home." Morrison's smile was cruel as he drew his weapon. "Then you've just killed everyone you love, Sergeant." The peaceful life that Sam had built through kindness and solitude was about to be tested in the crucible of violence and old enemies. But this time, he wouldn't face the battle alone. The modified pack saddle lay across Sam's workbench, its leather, straps reinforced with metal rings and padded with extra wool to distribute weight evenly across Rosie's back. What had once been a simple carrying harness had been transformed into something that could hold essential supplies, ammunition, and medical provisions through whatever ordeal lay ahead. Sam's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each buckle and strap with the attention to detail that had once kept cavalry mounts battle-ready. But this wasn't preparation for military campaign. This was getting ready to protect his family in a fight he might not survive. The standoff with Morrison had ended in temporary stalemate 12 hours ago. The gang leader had withdrawn his men after the donkey's alarm call brought riders from 3 neighboring ranches, armed and ready to investigate the disturbance. Morrison was many things, but he wasn't foolish enough to engage in a pitched battle when he could achieve his goals through subtler means. But the reprieve was temporary. Morrison had made his demands clear. Sam would surrender himself within 24 hours, or the gang would begin killing townspeople until he did. It was the kind of cruel logic that turned personal vendettas into community tragedies. And Sam knew Morrison well enough to believe he would follow through on the threat. "You're not seriously considering this," Sarah said from the barn doorway. Her voice was carefully controlled, but Sam could hear the strain beneath her composed exterior. "I don't have a choice." Sam continued working on the pack saddle, focusing on the practical details to avoid looking at her face. "Morrison won't stop until he gets what he wants, and what he wants is me. So you're just going to walk into his trap? Sacrifice yourself for his revenge?" Sam finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the lamplit barn. "I'm going to end this before it spreads to innocent people. There's a difference." Sarah stepped closer, her expression shifting from anger to something more complex. "Is there? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're so consumed with guilt about your past that you're eager to throw your life away." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Sam had indeed carried the weight of survivor's guilt for years, wondering why he had lived when his family died, questioning every choice that had led to that terrible night on the wagon train. But this wasn't about guilt. This was about responsibility. "Those people in town don't deserve to suffer for my history with Morrison," Sam said. "And you and David don't deserve to be targets because you chose to trust me. Don't we get a say in that choice?" Sarah's voice rose with frustration. "Don't we get to decide if we're willing to face danger to keep you alive?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. In the week since Sarah had brought her fears about the scouts to his door, something had grown between them, tentative, unspoken, but real enough that the thought of leaving her behind felt like abandoning part of himself. "I'm not walking into Morrison's trap," Sam said finally. "I'm setting my own." He spread his tactical map across the workbench beside the pack saddle, pointing to the winding trail that led to Devil's Canyon. "This is where it started, where I found Jenny, Buck and Rosie dying beside that dead tree. It seems fitting that it should end there too." Sarah studied the map, her intelligence quickly grasping the strategic implications of the terrain. "You're going to lure him away from town. The canyon offers advantages, limited approaches, high ground for defensive positions, and terrain that favors someone who knows it well over someone who doesn't." Sam traced the route with his finger. "Morrison will follow because he wants this to be personal, one-on-one. His ego won't let him resist the symbolism. And then what? You're still outnumbered 8-1. Sam's smile held no humor. "I won't be alone." As if summoned by his words, Jenny appeared in the barn doorway, followed closely by Buck and Rosie. The 3 donkeys had been staying closer to the building since Morrison's visit, their behavior indicating they understood that danger was approaching. "You can't be serious," Sarah breathed. "You're planning to take them into battle." "I'm planning to give them the choice," Sam corrected. "They're not livestock, Sarah. They're family. They've earned the right to decide whether they want to stand and fight or seek safety somewhere else." He knelt beside Rosie, the smallest and gentlest of the 3, fitting the modified pack saddle to her frame with careful attention to comfort and balance. She stood patiently, her dark eyes watching his face with the trust that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "She's too small for this," Sarah protested. "She's tougher than she looks," Sam replied, "and smarter. If anyone can carry supplies through difficult terrain and keep them safe, it's Rosie." Buck snorted and stamped, drawing attention to himself, with the jealous demeanor of someone being left out of important preparations. Sam chuckled, despite the gravity of the situation. "Don't worry, Buck. You've got your own job." He retrieved a leather collar he had modified with metal studs and reinforced stitching. "If we're going into battle, we might as well look the part." The collar transformed Buck from a domestic donkey into something that looked almost martial, like the war animals Sam had seen in military histories. But more than appearance, the collar provided protection for Buck's throat and neck, vulnerable areas that could be targeted by weapons or predators. Jenny received no special equipment beyond her normal halter, but Sam spent long minutes brushing her coat and speaking quietly to her about what lay ahead. She was the leader of their small herd, the one whose decisions would influence how Buck and Rosie responded to danger. "I wish I could explain this to you properly," Sam murmured as he worked. "Wish I could tell you that you don't have to come, that you've already done more than enough just by being here when I needed family." Jenny's response was to rest her large head against his chest, a gesture of affection and trust that needed no translation. As Sam worked through the evening, preparing equipment and supplies for what he hoped would be the final confrontation with Morrison, neighbors began arriving at the ranch. Word of the morning standoff had spread through the community, and the people of Copper Creek had decided they weren't willing to let one of their own face the threat alone. Doc Whitmore arrived with his medical bag and enough supplies to treat gunshot wounds. Martha from the saloon brought food enough to feed an army, along with information she had gathered about the gang's movements and numbers. Even Mayor Caldwell appeared, armed with an old army rifle and the determined expression of a man who had decided that principle mattered more than personal safety. "Sam," the mayor said as the impromptu gathering settled around the kitchen table, "we know what Morrison demanded. We also know you're planning something that doesn't involve surrendering to that bastard." Sam looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over his years in Copper Creek, people who had accepted him as one of their own, long before they knew his true name or military background. "This isn't your fight," he said. "Like hell it isn't," Martha replied with characteristic bluntness. "That gang threatens all of us. You just happen to be the one with the training to do something about it." Doc Whitmore leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. "Son, I've been watching you for years, wondering when that haunted look in your eyes would either heal or kill you. Tonight, I think I'm seeing it transform into something else entirely." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've remembered that being part of a community means accepting help when it's offered, and trusting others to stand with you when the fight comes to your door." Sam felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he had maintained over his emotions for so many years. These people knew who he really was now, knew about the deception that had created Sam Mackenzie from the ashes of Samuel McKenna's destroyed life, and they were still here, still willing to fight beside him. "All right," Sam said finally. "Here's what we're going to do." He outlined his plan, the careful choreography of movements that would draw Morrison and his gang away from town and into the canyon where terrain and preparation could level the odds. Each person would have a role, each position chosen for maximum effectiveness and safety. But as the evening wore on and the details were refined, Sam found himself looking repeatedly toward the barn where 3 donkeys waited with patient trust. For whatever he decided, they had no voice in the planning, no say in the strategies that might cost lives. But their presence was the foundation on which everything else was built. Without Jenny's protective loyalty, Buck's intelligence, and Rosie's gentle faith, Sam would still be the isolated, guilt-ridden man who had hidden from the world rather than engage with it. They had taught him that connections were worth the risk of loss, that family could be chosen as well as born. Tomorrow he would find out if the bonds forged through kindness and sustained by loyalty could survive the ultimate test of violence and vengeance. As the gathering broke up and people returned to their homes to prepare for what might be their final night of peace, Sarah lingered behind. She found Sam in the barn, making final adjustments to the donkey's equipment by lamplight. "I understand why you have to do this," she said quietly, "but I need you to understand something too." Sam looked up from checking Rosie's pack straps. "David and we've been alone for a long time. These past few weeks with you have shown us what it feels like to be part of a family again. So when you ride out tomorrow to face Morrison, you're not just fighting for principle or duty or whatever noble cause you tell yourself." She moved closer, her hand finding his in the warm darkness of the barn. "You're fighting for the life we could build together, if you're brave enough to come back and claim it." The kiss that followed was gentle and fierce, a promise and a farewell, wrapped in a moment that made everything else seem secondary. When they separated, Sam realized that the choice facing him tomorrow wasn't just about survival. It was about whether he had the courage to believe in a future worth living. In their stalls, 3 donkeys watched with the patient wisdom of creatures who understood that love was always worth defending, no matter the cost. The cavalry bugle felt foreign in Sam's hands after so many years of disuse, its brass surface tarnished, but the engravings still crisp beneath his fingers. He had carried it through dozens of military campaigns, using its clear notes to coordinate attacks and signal retreats across battlefields where confusion could mean death. Now, as dawn broke over the mountains and painted Devil's Canyon in shades of gold and crimson, the bugle would serve as his final coordination tool, a way to signal his neighbors when the time came for them to play their part in the desperate plan he had crafted. Sam sat astride Bell at the canyon's mouth, the 3 donkeys positioned around him like the tactical unit they had somehow become. Jenny stood alert and ready, her grey coat gleaming in the morning light and her ears constantly tracking sounds from the surrounding area. Buck paced with nervous energy, the metal-studded collar around his neck giving him an almost military bearing. Rosie, smallest but perhaps most crucial to the plan's success, wore her modified pack saddle loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and the emergency provisions that might mean the difference between victory and disaster. The canyon stretched before them, exactly as it had 8 years ago when Sam had first discovered 3 dying donkeys tied to a skeleton tree. The dead tree was still there, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The irony wasn't lost on Sam that this place, where his life had changed through an act of mercy, might now be where that life ended through an act of war. But he was no longer the same man who had found those abandoned animals. The isolation and guilt that had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains had been replaced by connections that made survival worth fighting for. Sarah and David, waiting. Back at the ranch, Doc Whitmore and the others positioned along the escape routes, and 3 animals whose loyalty had transformed them from rescued creatures into family. The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, and Sam felt his old military instincts sharpened to razor focus. Morrison and his gang were coming, drawn by the careful trail of signs Sam had left during his pre-dawn ride, tracks that were easy to follow, campfire ashes still warm, the unmistakable evidence of a man who wanted to be found. Morrison appeared, first riding with the confident posture of a man who believed victory was inevitable. Behind him came 7 hardened criminals, each armed and dangerous, their faces bearing the cruel indifference of men who killed for profit. They entered the canyon in loose formation, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky terrain. Well, Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The famous Sergeant McKenna, returning to the scene of his greatest triumph. How poetic. Sam remained silent, his hands steady on Bell's reins as he waited for Morrison to position his men exactly where the tactical plan required them to be. The canyon's narrow confines would limit their mobility, while providing Sam with the defensive advantages he had mapped so carefully. "Nothing to say, Sergeant? No final speeches about duty and honor before I kill you?" Morrison's men spread out, as much as the terrain allowed, but they were still confined by the canyon walls, exactly as Sam had planned. He raised the bugle to his lips and sounded a single, clear note that rang through the morning air like a church bell. The signal brought immediate response from the donkeys. Jenny moved to Sam's left flank, positioning herself between him and 3 of Morrison's men. Buck circled to the right, his intelligence allowing him to understand the tactical situation even without military training. Rosie backed toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide cover, her precious cargo protected by natural barriers. "Animals," Morrison sneered. "You brought farm animals to a gunfight, McKenna. Has isolation finally driven you completely mad?" "These aren't farm animals," Sam replied quietly. "They're family." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Family? They're beasts of burden, nothing more. And when I'm finished with you, they'll make a fine meal for my men." The casual cruelty of the threat ignited something fierce in Sam's chest, a protective rage that burned away the last remnants of doubt about what he had to do. Morrison represented everything Sam had fought against during his military service: the corruption, the callous disregard for innocent life, the willingness to cause suffering for personal gain. "You made one mistake, Morrison," Sam said, his hand moving to his weapon. "And what's that, Sergeant? You threatened my family." The gunfight erupted with the sudden violence of a mountain thunderstorm. Morrison's men opened fire immediately, their bullets whistling through the canyon air and striking sparks from the stone walls. But Sam had chosen his position carefully. The rocky outcroppings provided cover while allowing clear fields of fire toward his enemies. Bell responded to the chaos with the trained composure of a cavalry mount, standing steady despite the noise and danger. Sam's first shots were precise, aimed not to kill but to disable, wounding Morrison's men enough to reduce their effectiveness without creating martyrs who would fuel future vengeance. But the donkeys' response exceeded every expectation. Sam had harbored about their capabilities. Jenny charged directly toward Morrison's position, with a fury that seemed to emerge from some primal protective instinct. Her braying was fierce and continuous, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and multiplied into something that spoke of ancient wildness barely contained by domestication. 2 of Morrison's men fired at her, but their shots went wide as their horses shied away from the unexpected assault. Buck's intelligence manifested as tactical awareness that rivaled trained military thinking. He seemed to understand that the gang's horses were their greatest vulnerability in the confined space, and he moved to exploit that weakness with purposeful aggression. His kicks were precisely aimed, not at the riders, but at their mounts' legs and flanks, injuries that would eliminate mobility without necessarily causing fatal harm. Even Rosie, burdened with her precious cargo, positioned herself with strategic awareness that kept the supplies safe while allowing her to serve as Sam's eyes and ears for threats approaching from behind. Morrison's confident expression shifted to confusion, and then alarm as his coordinated attack dissolved into chaos. His men found themselves fighting not just Sam, but 3 animals who seemed to understand military tactics better than most human soldiers. "What the hell?" one of the gang members shouted as Buck's precisely aimed kick sent his horse stumbling. "They're just animals!" Morrison bellowed, but his voice carried the strain of a man whose carefully laid plans were falling apart. Sam's second bugle call echoed through the canyon, the signal for the next phase of his plan. From the canyon rim above, Doc Whitmore and the other townspeople began their coordinated harassment, raining down rocks and debris that further disrupted Morrison's formation. But even as the tactical situation shifted in Sam's favor, he knew the real test was still to come. Morrison wasn't just any criminal. He was a former cavalry officer with his own military training and a decade of bitter hatred fueling his determination. The personal confrontation that had brought them to this place was about to begin in earnest. The broken chain lay half buried in the canyon dirt where it had fallen years ago. a rusted remnant of the cruelty that had bound 3 donkeys to a dead tree and left them to die. Sam glimpsed it as he dove behind a boulder, Morrison's latest volley of gunfire chipping stone fragments that stung his face like angry wasps. The battle had turned against him. Despite the initial success of his tactical plan, Morrison's military training had reasserted itself as the former cavalry officer adapted to the unexpected chaos of fighting alongside animals. 3 of his men were down, wounded but not dead, while the remaining 4 had regrouped under Morrison's shouted orders and were systematically driving Sam back toward the canyon's dead end. Belle had taken a bullet in her flank and was limping badly, though she still responded to Sam's commands with the brave heart that had carried her through years of frontier hardships. Jenny was bleeding from a graze across her shoulder, but continued to position herself between Sam and the attackers, her protective instincts undimmed by pain. Buck had been forced back by concentrated gunfire, his tactical intelligence no match. For superior numbers and firepower, only Rosie remained untouched, her small size and the natural camouflage of her position among the rocks having kept her hidden from Morrison's attention. But Sam could see her trembling with the effort of remaining still while everything she cared about was under attack. "Give it up, McKenna!" Morrison called from behind his own rocky shelter. "You're trapped, your horse is wounded, and those ridiculous animals of yours are going to get themselves killed trying to protect you." Sam checked his ammunition with the methodical efficiency of a soldier who understood that counting bullets could mean the difference between victory and death. He had enough rounds for perhaps 2 more minutes of sustained fighting, after which he would be reduced to his knife and whatever improvised weapons he could find. The mathematics of survival were grimly clear. Morrison still had 4 men capable of fighting, and they held superior positions with clear fields of fire toward Sam's rapidly shrinking defensive perimeter. The townspeople on the canyon rim were too far away to provide direct assistance, and the terrain that had initially favored Sam was now working against him as Morrison's men maneuvered to surround his position. "You know how this ends, Sergeant," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the cruel satisfaction of approaching victory. "But I'm feeling generous today. Surrender now, and I'll make your death quick. Keep fighting, and I'll take my time with you and with anyone else who gets in my way." The threat to Sarah and David was implicit but clear. Morrison wouldn't be satisfied with just killing Sam. He would extend his revenge to everyone Sam cared about, making their suffering payment for the humiliation of his court-martial and imprisonment. Sam rose from behind his boulder and fired 2 quick shots, forcing Morrison's men to duck for cover. But the movement exposed him to return fire that drove splinters from the rock beside his head and made Belle shy nervously despite her training. That was when Rosie made her decision. The smallest donkey had been watching the battle with the intense concentration of someone trying to understand a complex problem. Her dark eyes had tracked the movements of Morrison's men, noting their positions and their apparent focus on Sam's location. What she decided required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with size or strength and everything to do with love. Rosie left the safety of her rocky shelter and began climbing toward the canyon rim, following a narrow trail that goats might use but that no human could navigate without ropes and equipment. Her small hooves found purchase on stone ledges barely wide enough for her passage, and her modified pack saddle balanced perfectly as she ascended with the sure-footed grace that was a donkey's birthright. Morrison's men, focused on their frontal assault against Sam's position, never looked up to see the small figure making her way along the canyon wall 50 feet above their heads. "Boss!" one of the gang members called out. "That animal! It's above us!" Morrison glanced up just as Rosie reached the point she'd been seeking, a narrow ledge directly over the largest concentration of his men. For a moment, human and animal locked eyes across the vertical distance, and Morrison's face twisted with understanding and rage. "Shoot that damned thing!" he shouted, but Rosie had already committed to her course of action. With a courage that defied every instinct of self-preservation, she launched herself from the ledge in a desperate leap that carried her past the grasping hands of Morrison's men and directly into the heart of their defensive position. Her landing scattered the gang members like bowling pins, their horses rearing and plunging in panic as a small donkey appeared among them as if dropped from the sky. But more than the physical disruption, Rosie's attack created something that military strategists called the decisive moment, the instant when a battle's outcome shifts from probable defeat to possible victory. Buck understood immediately. With a bray that might have been approval or fury, he charged from his forced retreat directly toward the confusion Rosie had created. His metal-studded collar gleamed in the morning sun as he bowled over one of Morrison's men, his kicks precisely aimed to disable rather than kill. Jenny followed her herdmate's lead with the protective instincts of a creature defending her family. Her injured shoulder forgotten, she positioned herself between the remaining gang members and their horses, cutting off their primary means of escape and mobility. Sam rose from behind his boulder with his revolver steady in his hand and the clear field of fire that Rosie's sacrifice had created. His first shot took Morrison in the shoulder, spinning the former cavalry officer around and sending his weapon flying. His second shot disabled the last gang member capable of effective resistance. The canyon fell silent, except for the echo of gunshots fading among the stone walls and the labored breathing of wounded men and animals. Morrison struggled to his knees, his face pale with pain and shock as he stared at the small donkey who had destroyed his carefully planned revenge. "An animal," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Brought down by a goddamn animal." "No," Sam said, walking toward the injured man with his weapon trained but no longer needed. "Brought down by loyalty, something you never understood." Rosie stood among the scattered gang members, her pack saddle intact and her legs steady despite her incredible leap. She looked towards Sam, with eyes that held no pride in her courage, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and family protected. The broken chain in the dirt told the story of transformation, from abandoned creatures, left to die, to protectors, willing to risk everything for those they loved. It was a transformation that applied to more than just the donkeys, Sam realized, as he looked around the canyon, where his past had finally been settled and his future secured. Morrison's revenge had failed, not because of superior tactics or firepower, but because he had never understood that some bonds were stronger than hatred, and some courage came not from training, but from the simple desire to protect what mattered most. The new brass nameplate gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its freshly engraved letters catching the golden light that filtered through the autumn air. McKenna Ranch. Sam stood back to admire the installation, his weathered hand still holding the screwdriver he had used to mount it beside his front door. Samuel McKenna, his real name, spoken aloud without shame or fear for the first time in 8 years. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in Devil's Canyon, and the changes in Sam's life had been as dramatic as the seasons that had shifted from the violence of summer into the peaceful promise of harvest time. Morrison was serving a life sentence in the territorial prison, his remaining gang members either dead or facing their own lengthy incarcerations. The threat that had driven Sam into hiding was finally, permanently ended. But more than the external changes, Sam had undergone an internal transformation that went far deeper than simply reclaiming his name. The guilt and isolation that had defined his existence as Sam Mackenzie had been replaced by something he hadn't felt since before his family's death, a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than his own survival. "It looks good," Sarah said from behind him, her voice carrying the warm approval of someone who understood the significance of the moment. She had moved permanently to the ranch 2 weeks ago, bringing David and the promise of the family that Sam had thought was lost to him forever. The wedding was planned for Christmas, a quiet ceremony in the church at Copper Creek with Doc Whitmore, officiating, and the entire town invited to celebrate. It would be the first time in years that Sam had looked forward to the future with genuine excitement rather than resigned acceptance. "Papa, Sam!" David came running around the corner of the cabin, his 8-year-old energy barely contained by the approaching evening. "Jenny won't let Buck near the apple tree again. She's being mean," Sam chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair with the casual affection that had developed between them. David had taken to calling him Papa Sam almost immediately after learning his real name, and the title had stuck with the natural ease of a relationship built on trust and genuine care. "Jenny's just making sure there are apples left for everyone," Sam explained. "Buck would eat them all if she didn't keep him in line." The Shire, 3 donkeys, had become local celebrities in the months following their heroic actions in the canyon. Visitors came from as far as the territorial capital to see the animals whose courage and intelligence had turned the tide of battle against the notorious Blackstone gang. But fame hadn't changed them. They remained the same loyal, intelligent creatures who had transformed Sam's life through their presence and devotion. Jenny had fully recovered from her shoulder wound and resumed her role as the unofficial leader of the ranch's operations. Her protective instincts now extended to David, with the same fierce dedication she showed to Sam, and the boy had learned to trust her judgment about everything from weather patterns to the safety of various ranch activities. Buck had grown into a magnificent animal whose intelligence continued to amaze everyone who worked with him. The territorial governor himself had visited to see the donkey who had displayed tactical awareness that rivaled trained military thinking. And Buck had performed with the dignity of someone who understood his own importance. But it was Rosie who had captured the imagination of everyone who heard the story of her incredible leap from the canyon rim. Newspaper reporters had traveled from Denver and San Francisco to interview Sam about the donkey whose courage had saved his life, and her fame had spread throughout the Western Territories. The attention embarrassed Rosie, who remained fundamentally the same gentle, intuitive animal who had first approached Sam with trusting affection. She still followed him around the ranch during his daily chores, still seemed to understand his moods better than he understood them himself, and still possessed the quiet wisdom that had made her his closest companion during the lonely years. Before Sarah and David joined his life, Doc Whitmore rode up the lane as Sam was putting away his tools, the elderly physician's regular evening visit having become one of the comforting routines that marked the peaceful rhythms of ranch life. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing age, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see justice done. "Samuel McKenna," the doctor said, testing the name with obvious pleasure. "I have to say, it suits you better than Sam Mackenzie ever did." "It feels right," Sam admitted, "like I'm finally whole again." They sat on the porch as they had countless evenings before, watching the donkeys graze in the paddock while Sarah prepared dinner, and David's laughter echoed from the barn where he was supposedly helping with chores. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so completely normal, that Sam sometimes had to remind himself of the violence and loss that had brought him to this place. "You know," Doc Whitmore said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what those animals of yours accomplished in that canyon. People are calling it heroic, and I suppose it was, but I think they were just being themselves, loyal, protective, intelligent creatures who understood what needed to be done. They saved my life," Sam said simply. "They did more than that. They saved your soul." The truth of those words settled over Sam like a comfortable blanket. The donkeys hadn't just intervened in a physical battle. They had been instrumental in the longer, more important fight to reclaim his identity and his capacity for human connection. As evening settled over the ranch and the mountains painted themselves in shades of purple and gold, Sam reflected on the circular nature of his story. He had come to this place broken and hiding, determined to live in isolation rather than risk the pain of loss. 3 abandoned animals had changed that trajectory, teaching him that some connections were worth any risk. Now, surrounded by the family he had chosen and been chosen by, Sam understood that kindness was indeed an investment that paid dividends in ways that couldn't be predicted or measured. The mercy he had shown to 3 dying donkeys had been returned 1,000-fold in the form of loyalty, protection, and the kind of love that transformed lives. Jenny approached the porch as darkness fell, her evening routine bringing her close to the house for a final check on her human family. Sam reached out to scratch behind her ears, and she leaned into his touch with the contentment of an animal who knew she was exactly where she belonged. "Thank you," he whispered to her, and to Buck and Rosie, and to the forces of chance or providence that had brought them together on that desperate morning in Devil's Canyon so many years ago. The brass nameplate on his door caught the lamplight. From the cabin windows, its engraved letters proclaiming to the world that Samuel McKenna was no longer hiding from his past or his identity. He was home, surrounded by family both human and animal, ready to face whatever the future might bring with the courage that comes from knowing you don't have to face it alone. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the stars, but the sound held no menace for the occupants of the McKenna Ranch. They had each other, and that was enough to face down any darkness that might come.